Jimmy Washington, a 13-year-old boy, was walking down the familiar streets of Oakwood. He loved this neighborhood. It wasn't just home. It was filled with the sweet smell of his grandmother's cookies and the warmth of her hugs. Every Sunday, he would visit her house, and though he was getting older, it still felt like his safe haven. Today, he was making his way there after school, hands stuffed in his pockets, his mind on the new game he was eager to play at her house. It wasn't a long walk, just a few blocks, but it was peaceful, and he enjoyed the short moments of solitude. As he passed the corner store, he noticed something strange. Two police officers, Officer Grant and Officer Baker, were walking slowly behind him. At first, Jimmy didn't think much of it. Oakwood was a safe neighborhood, and the police were supposed to protect people, not cause harm. But as he kept walking, he noticed the officers' pace had quickened. They were getting closer. A lot closer. Jimmy glanced back once, and then again. Officer Grant's gaze was fixed directly on him, and Officer Baker was scanning the area, his eyes narrowing as they met Jimmy's. There was something unsettling in their expressions, stern, cold. He couldn't shake the feeling they were following him. He walked a little faster, trying to brush off the unease creeping up his spine. But the officers kept following, getting even closer. Their footsteps now matched his pace. "Hey, kid." Officer Grant's voice cut through the air, gruff and commanding. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. He stopped in his tracks, turning to face the officers, his hands now gripping his phone in his pocket. "Where do you think you're going?" Officer Grant asked, his tone sharp, almost accusatory. Jimmy swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He forced himself to remain calm. "To my grandmother's house, sir. It's just down the road." But the officers didn't seem to care. They started firing questions at him, ones that didn't make sense. "What are you doing here? Where do you live? Why are you in this neighborhood?" Jimmy's mind raced, and his anxiety began to rise. Why were they asking all these questions? He wasn't doing anything wrong. "I'm just visiting my grandma, sir," he repeated, his voice trembling slightly. Officer Grant wasn't having it. "You're not from around here. Let me see what's in your pockets." Jimmy froze, unsure of what to do. He had nothing illegal, nothing dangerous. Just a small box with a scarf he'd bought for his grandmother. But the officers were insistent. Officer Grant started searching through his pockets, without asking for permission. Jimmy's pulse quickened as his heart raced. He could barely breathe. "I'm just trying to get to my grandma's house," Jimmy pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Baker stood silently, watching the scene unfold. He didn't speak, but Jimmy could tell by the way he shifted uncomfortably that he wasn't entirely on board with what was happening. Still, he didn't intervene. As Jimmy felt the officer's eyes on him, his thoughts raced to his father. Chief Andre Washington. Jimmy's dad had just been appointed as the new chief of police, and he had always told him, "If you ever feel unsafe, call me right away." Jimmy wasn't sure why these officers were treating him like this, but the weight of his father's words felt real now. Jimmy quickly took out his phone and dialed his father. The phone buzzed in his ear, and he heard it ring. He could barely keep his hands steady as he waited. Then, his dad's voice came through, calm but filled with concern. "Jimmy? What's going on?" Jimmy quickly explained the situation, telling his dad that two officers were following him, questioning him, and searching his pockets. His voice quivered with fear, but he tried to stay calm. He could hear his dad's breath catch on the other end. "Stay right there, son. I'm on my way." Jimmy hung up the phone, feeling a little relief, but still terrified. He looked up to see Officer Grant still glaring at him, as if Jimmy was the one who had done something wrong. Just then, from the corner of his eye, Jimmy saw a familiar black car pull up to the intersection. His heart leapt in his chest. It was his dad. The officers were still standing there, questioning him, but as Chief Washington stepped out of his car, Officer Grant's eyes widened in surprise. The color drained from his face. Chief Washington, sir," Officer Grant stammered, unsure of what to say. Chief Washington's face was stern as he walked toward the scene. He looked down at Jimmy for a moment, then back up at the officers, his gaze unwavering. "What's going on here?" Chief Washington asked, his voice firm. Officer Grant and Officer Baker exchanged uneasy glances. Neither seemed to know how to respond. Finally, Officer Grant spoke, his voice quieter now. "We thought the kid was suspicious, sir. He didn't look like he belonged here." Chief Washington's gaze turned hard, the disappointment in his eyes cutting through the air. "Suspicious? My son," he asked slowly. "This is his neighborhood. He's walking to his grandmother's house just down the street." Officer Baker looked down, guilt now clear on his face. "Sir, we didn't know." Chief Washington's voice was calm, but full of authority. "You didn't know? You never even bothered to ask. You assumed." He took a step closer to both officers. "Does a young boy walking to his grandmother's house really look like a threat to you?" The officers remained silent, unable to meet Chief Washington's gaze. "From now on," the chief continued, his voice sharp, "you will treat every person in this community with respect, just as you would want your family treated. And you will think before you make assumptions." There was a long pause. Finally, Officer Baker nodded, his face red with embarrassment. "Yes, sir," he murmured. Chief Washington turned back to Jimmy, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Let's go, son," he said quietly, guiding Jimmy away from the officers. As they walked away, Jimmy couldn't help but feel proud of his dad. Justice had been served. The officers had learned a lesson today, one they wouldn't soon forget. They had judged the wrong person, and now they knew the price of making assumptions. Jimmy knew this wouldn't change everything in Oakwood, but it was a start. With his father's leadership, the town had a chance to become a better, fairer place for everyone. As they got into the car, Jimmy looked up at his father. "Thanks, Dad." Chief Washington smiled softly at him, his eyes full of warmth. "You're welcome, son. And remember, always stand up for yourself. But most importantly, always treat others with respect." Jimmy nodded, feeling safer and more hopeful than he had in a long time. Subscribe to our channel for soul-stirring stories.